I'd like to welcome all of you to this particular panel, which is named The Global Inequality of Disaster Management. I'm going to introduce the panel participants. In addition to myself, who will be actually making some of the opening comments, I have to my left, not in the order that they're sitting, but if they could say hello, Dr. Karen Rice, Assistant Professor of Social Work and the Chair of the Department of Social Work. Dr. Marc Felizzi, Assistant Professor of Social Work. Dr. Duane Hagelgans, an Assistant Professor of Emergency Management. Dr. Sepideh Yalda, Professor of Meteorology and the Director for the Center for Disaster Research and Education. And also Dr. Robert Bookmiller, Associate Professor of Government and Political Affairs and Director of MU's International Studies Program. So, we decided to use as a launching point about this very actually significant discussion and connections between income inequality, not only domestic income inequality, but kind of the global macro view on the disparities we have wealth-wise around the world, to connect it to two major initiatives that the Center for Disaster Research and Education did this past fall. One that took place on the site of our partner university in Valparaiso, Chile, and one that was a global research symposium that took place. The Chilean trip, we were actually saying just last Friday at this time, we were in Chile. It was last week, and so most recently completed, and picture of that, of us being at the university, and I'll come back to that more in just a moment. And also the research symposium that I know many of you attended. I see familiar faces that took place in early October. So October was a big month for the center, let's put it that way. And while we didn't go into the semester thinking about the implicit links and connections that existed between these two initiatives, it turned out that there was, well, to borrow the term, a wealth of connections and linkages and ways that we are going to try to forge for you today and hopefully give you some food for thought and reflection on this very critical topic in our field. So the kind of template, the flow of today's panel is going to be the following. One is that we'll talk just a little bit to bring you up to speed for those of you who are not in the field about what emergency management is. Then we will make and forge some of the links for you with regard to income inequality and how it very, very is symbiotically tied to the field of disaster emergency management. And then we're going to shift gears and move to a more roundtable format where the group, most of the group, will be talking about their specific discipline perspective during the visit to Chile. And then end actually with my colleague and husband, Dr. Robert Bookmiller, and I'll make a few comments along with him to then bring it back to home, to the United States, because we're very sensitive to this idea that this is an issue that just happens elsewhere. We will see, as I said, very powerful connections with regard to income vulnerability and social disparity and disaster management here in the United States through the lens, which is an excellent lens to use, of Hurricane Katrina, which took place 10 years ago this coming August. So we'll have a few kind of introductory slides. We'll switch to the round table. I believe we'll end also with a few slides too. So with regard to emergency management, I hope that you can see the screens. With regard to how to think about it. It is a field. That was actually something that came actually to our attention in the process of being in Chile, that not everyone thinks of it yet as a field, as a profession, as a discipline, but it certainly is one here in the United States. And it has a managerial function. This is actually FEMA's, kind of a FEMA-based definition, charged with creating the framework within which communities reduce vulnerability to hazards and cope with disasters. It seeks to promote safer, less vulnerable communities with the capacity to cope with hazards and disasters. And if you'll notice up on the screen, I've actually kind of put in gold this notion of vulnerability, which is going to come up again and again, and as I said, is intrinsically paired with the idea of income inequality. And so just to be clear and make sure we're all on the same page in terms of thinking about vulnerability, this is the potential to suffer harm or loss. So keep that definition in the back of your mind as we talk about what we do in the management of emergencies and disasters and how we, as I said, partner that with some of the issues with regard to income inequality. With regard to who's involved in emergency management, we mostly, the first thing we come to are the three sectors that are in what would be, I believe, your left hand of the slide, which are fire services, police, and emergency medical personnel. And this is a very common conception of what emergency management means, not only here in the United States, but around the world. But if you look at the right hand of the slide, you'll see, in fact, and this will come out very much in the discussions we're about to have, that the discipline and the profession, it cuts across all sectors of society. This is actually an abbreviated list. When we were brainstorming on this for a presentation in Chile, we were coming up with so many, and we said, okay, we have to stop. We'll just put the ones that we think hit the big areas. But it cross-cuts across all of society. And so it's everything from your psychologists and your social workers dealing with regard to the trauma piece that we'll talk about more in just a moment. It's your urban planners, which we'll be also highlighting as an element. It's the involvement of business in a variety of ways, teachers and educators. I know obviously we started as an education institution in 1855, and I know we have a lot of pre-service teachers. You're an integral part of the emergency management landscape in more ways that you could possibly imagine. And in fact, in Chile, we had a lot of teachers and principals come to our talks because they were very interested in their role in that. It certainly involves science and technology experts, not only from the extremely profound challenge of climate change, but a variety of other areas, of course, policy and decision makers, and then our grassroots community leaders. So this is just, as I said, a short list, but the idea is we wanted you to have an expanded view of who's involved with regard to this question. And again, it sets the stage for some of the things we're going to raise in just a moment. Emergency management is also more than just the response. This is, again, a misconception that we often confront that's not unique to anyone in particular, but and that's, I think, human nature too. Okay, this has happened to us, how are we going to respond to it? But the field is actually much, much broader than that. And in the old days, we talked about a linear view of these stages, but we now kind of got a little bit smarter over the past 5 to 10 years, and we know now it's a cycle. That we can't really pull it out and say this is a particular point. They're all connected to each other. They're constantly reinforcing and running back into each other. So it goes from everything from preparedness, thinking ahead of what steps one can take, what measures can take, to kind of reduce both the risk of a major disaster happening as well as reducing the damage caused by that disaster. And there's a variety of steps we can take that way. We also talk about disaster risk reduction, DRR. This is a big phrase in United Nations speak right now with regard to reducing the potential causes that would lead to the disaster having such a significant impact. Mitigation, trying to go after the damage, reducing the amount of damage that would be actually caused by a kind of traumatic event. Resilience, and kind of response recovery, very much linked together. Resilience is probably our newest word that we're really wrestling with in the profession with regard to how quickly a community can recover, how it can rebound, basically its rebound aspect to it, and recover perhaps not only to a place that they were before, which actually could not be a very acceptable place, but perhaps even to improve the situation around them in that recovery process. And then response, obviously, I think is pretty straightforward, but after a disaster event happens, and I should note, parenthetically, the focus specifically, while there are many, many types of events, we're focusing on two that are as a result of, we have to kind of put this in quotes, natural disasters, which we'll see have a natural element, but lots and lots of human cause aspects to it that made then the natural disaster even worse. And then coordination amongst all of this is really key. So again, keep not only that expanded view of who's involved in emergency management, but also that expanded and broader, more comprehensive view of what the field involves. Before moving on to kind of what the focus of this entire conference is today, just to bring to your attention, and you'll see one of them that, again, I have also put in gold, that we face a lot of challenges. This is a rather new field. None of us have any of the answers. We're constantly scrambling. I have to, I think, face the fact, as do my colleagues, we won't get at these answers within our lifetime. We're continuing to just, forge ahead with research to figure out these kinds of things. But some of the current challenges we do see is to get the community, all sectors of the community, men, women, and children, the young and the old, the private sector, the public sector, all to believe they have a stake in the outcomes of what happens in relation to the disasters that befall us. There are many disasters we cannot stop, period, like an earthquake, but we can certainly kind of figure out how to manage the impacts of that disaster and how we recover from them. Disasters are increasing for a variety of reasons, principally with regard in terms of our natural hazards, climate change, as well as paired with urban settlement patterns where people are living, has really made then this challenge exponentially worse. And then the responders, due to budget cutbacks in many countries, including here, are frequently on the decline. And so we've got public policy challenges going in the opposite directions. But look at that, this is what I mentioned in gold, vulnerable populations. This is not a theme we're just highlighting because it's central to the symposium's focus. It's a theme that's really very dramatically important to us in emergency management in general. We wrestle with it constantly. There's a variety of types of vulnerability, and it is, yes, just neutrally speaking, a major challenge for us. Education at all levels, communication issues, which we can talk about in the Q&A if people have questions, but it's also very central. And then this just very significant disconnect between knowledge, practice, and policy. And think about that last element in particular as we talk about some of the challenges that we have witnessed and observed in Chile, as well as what we have experienced here in the United States. And how do we take what we know and how people are engaging in the profession and what we do with regard to our policy. That's perhaps in some ways the greatest challenge of all. Very briefly as a setup with regard to disaster management and income inequality, I just wanted to give you some themes that you'll see up on the screen that we know to be true. I mean, they're just absolutely the case wherever we're talking about. That when a disaster strikes, we know that the impact is not the same in any individual community. That a single community is impacted differently. And among the many variables that exist, one of them certainly is the issue of vulnerability. Now, vulnerability, as we talked about in terms of that potential exposure to risk and harm, there's a lot of different elements to it. But we absolutely know that with regard to economic groups, certain socioeconomic groups are much more exposed to the threats posed by disasters than others. This is 100%. Now, wealthier populations suffer the greater economic impact in terms of the measurements of sheer financial loss. So we can actually say those with more money lose more from the very specific calculation of, in our country, dollar figures. So on the one hand, this looks like, oh, well, those with more money lose more. Well, yes, financially, but it's actually the poorer populations with almost no economic or social safety net that really suffer most profoundly when a natural hazard exists on a variety of levels. And just to give you a quick capstone quote, which I think really captures it, says a recent review of studies on the relationship between poverty and disasters revealed that socioeconomic status is a significant predictor of the physical and the psychological impacts and the pre- and post-disaster stages. According to these studies, the poor are more likely to die, suffer from injuries, have proportionally higher material losses, have more psychological trauma, and face more obstacles during the phases of response, recovery, and reconstruction. So this does, in fact, seem like a very apt connection that we want to make in relation to this. So in terms of our panel discussion today, I'm going to do a little setup with regard to, we're going to be talking first about Chile and the April 2014 fires in particular. I will begin with a roundtable after a brief setup looking from the perspective of disaster law and policy. We'll then transition to Dr. Duane Hagelgans looking at it from the emergency management perspective, and then my two social work colleagues, Drs. Rice and social work colleagues, Drs. Rice and Felizzi, with regard to the social work perspective, and then Dr. Yalda looking at it from the perspective of climate change. And then we will go back in time, but bring it closer to home by looking at links that we made in terms of the August 2005 event known as Hurricane Katrina that we dedicated the symposium on. So in terms of Chile, why Chile? Why is the focus of this? Well, Chile is actually a partner country of Millersville and a partner university going back to 1999. We have very strong exchange connections, both in terms of student and faculty and programmatic collaboration. And so when we were looking to where we wanted to kind of dip our foot in terms of doing some international work, Chile, for a variety of reasons, seemed to be a natural place for us to go. We had a very trusted, long-standing partner there who, more importantly, trusted us and had a lot of confidence in us to do some work in this area. Dr. Yalda and I went down in March of 2013 to do some exploratory work with regard to doing some knowledge exchanges and workshops in the area of disaster management, and the university was very receptive to this, as was the larger community. And one of the things I should highlight is that Chile, unfortunately, is a very disaster-prone country in a variety of ways. It's grabbed more immediate international attention in relation to the earthquakes that it periodically has, as well as tsunamis, but it also has droughts and wildfires, and also industrial accidents, corporate-related accidents. You may have remembered of the Los 33, the 33, the miners, when the mine shaft collapsed a few years back. It just has a lot of, unfortunately, challenges along these lines. So we received a grant from the PASHI system and also with generous funding from social work and the center. We took a team down to begin what we will know, not hope, but know will be an ongoing kind of professional dialogue and exchange in these areas. So Chile is a smaller country population-wise, but for the purpose of this discussion, what I wanted to highlight is that it is considered to be an economically developed country. Now, it's at the very bottom of the developed. In other words, its indicators have just squeaked it into that category, but it is considered, in fact, to have a higher economic capacity than most of its neighbors in the region. And it was the first South American country to be able to join the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a marker of, in fact, development. However, the UN also ranks Chile as one of the top 15, now there's about 200 countries in the world, so this is a significant measure, of the most economically unequal countries in the world. The wealth concentration is very significantly focused in the elites, and it has a very tiny middle class, which is always, as I know some of the economics majors can tell you, we're always looking for a robust middle class. And in Chile, it's quite small. But it's doing really well in terms of wealth generation. It's the largest copper exporter in the world. It's going like gangbusters, and it has a lot of major exports. It's very vibrant. It's a very popular country internationally. But in the words of one scholar, it has prosperity without equality. So this is a theme that you want to kind of think about in light of the larger conference, a country that has money, but things are just completely, you hear again and again that a few families control much of the wealth and the business there. Now, when we had put in the grant, the following event had not happened. We were actually focusing on emergency management issues around earthquakes and tsunamis, but in the process of getting down there, between when we were awarded the grant, actually right around when we heard the good news about the grant, there was a very it was an absolutely unprecedented fire in Valparaiso. And just to go back actually to the map, I don't know if you can see it, but Valparaiso is, Santiago is the capital, and Valparaiso is right on the coast, right in the middle of the country in what they call the central region. It's a beautiful old city that is actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's very much known for its colorful houses. It has 7 hills, very, very steep with regard to the landscape. And these houses of all colors are built into it. In fact, a Chilean joke is that when they're painting their house, if they run out of paint, they just pull out another bucket of another bright color and just put that on another wall. So you might see a one house with 4 brightly different colors. But the overall look is really stunning. And so they have had a history of fires, and if I'm not incorrect, even by the time this fire had taken place, I think this had been the 5th of the fire season, even that year alone. But nothing could have really prepared them for this particular event. It was a perfect storm in a variety of ways. They were at the end of what has become the summer season. No rain, high winds, high heat. And there's, it's almost a little bit, it's not a joke because it's so tragic, but in terms of what they think started the fire, the Chileans will say, las aves, las aves. Does anyone know what las aves is? Aves? Or Spanish speakers? The birds? Yeah, the birds, exactly. And the idea went, they will never know, but that particularly heavy pelicans landed on electric wire, hit another electric wire. This caused sparks that immediately, it hit in the very, you can't quite see here, we'll show you another picture in just a moment, hit up in their forest area. This hit eucalyptus trees full of natural oils, which was an incinerant, and so it immediately set this off. And then it hits what we'll see in just a moment, these very, very poor areas that were built of wood, that had very little infrastructure with regard to sanitation, so there was a lot of garbage around, also massive amounts of underbrush, and with these winds, almost, in a very short period of time, 3,000 homes were gone. So I mean, they said it was like little bomblets, because both with the high winds constantly shifting, the garbage and the underbrush and the ash were just landing on other houses. They were wood, and they continued to catch on. And the most impacted were the poorer populations who lived in these high informal settlements, which I'll address in just a moment with regard to my comments. My colleagues got these pictures. I don't know if you can quite see them, but the one is at the top there where these forests had been, and then you can get an idea of these wooden houses being built in this impossible terrain. We would look at it, we just couldn't imagine how they were able to do this, and the pictures don't quite do it justice. So what I'm going to do is to put now my roundtable hat on and join my colleagues over here and get us started by just talking. Can you hear me? Just talking very briefly about the law and policy elements to this, because I do want to make sure that my colleagues have ample time to make their comments. And just highlight a few issues with regard to our connection of looking at income inequality. And I have to actually say, even in kind of looking at it again through the perspective of this conference, there's so many profound connections, and I know that my colleagues would agree. So just a quick few who, what, where, when, and why from the law and policy perspective is that in terms of where this fire took place, this was a population that mostly, people would tell you again and again, had moved from the rural areas, that were very poor. They were seeking, this sounds familiar to any place, right? Economic opportunity in the city. But where were they going to live in this really densely crowded metropolitan area? Well, there was room at the top of the hills. So it's a little reverse of what we see like in California, where these beautiful multi-million-dollar homes are way up in the hills and the poor are farther down. It was actually the wealthier were further down and the poorer were up in the hills. And they built with the cheapest materials available, which was wood. And they built overnight. Again, we heard this again from so many different people that we met with, that it was an instant. They would move in, and 20 of their family members would move in to basically lay claim. Now, they had no formal legal title. This is very, very important to keep in mind. They still don't have, in most cases, legal title. But they would settle it. They would make it a fact on the ground, and would build these houses, move their families in, and we would hear, we'd say, well, the government didn't do anything about it, and they said, oh, this would be a massively unpopular thing for the government to go in and take on the poor and say, you know, you have to get out of here. They had created a reality on the ground. So you had really significant population density in areas that were built way up, and because these were not official parts of city planning, there's no infrastructure up there. There's no sanitation. There are no pipes with waters running up. Think about this from the perspective of fire. As I said, unfortunately, we saw a lot of what were informal but significant kind of garbage areas, a lot of trash blowing around. These areas are just not attended to. So this is like, again, a part of our perfect storm is when these fires come in, they catch on fire quickly because they're wood. You don't have water to help put it out super quickly. You have garbage and underbrush because the city is not paying attention to it. And then the impact on this is that in terms of, okay, recovering, so to speak. So think about this. First of all, you've got potentially, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, again, we heard this repeatedly, maybe 20 family members living in a rather small house. Now here, okay, we've had a fire hit our house. You know, we might have the opportunity of going to our aunt's house, right? And moving in with them for a little bit. That's at least a possibility here. Well, in this case, Tia Maria is living with them, you know. The family structure of where they might relocate to is actually in the same house. So here again, we see this disproportionate impact with regard to when this disaster happens as opposed to other areas. They were not able to claim community grants because they did not have title to the land. The community grants were based on those that could actually show legal ownership. They rushed in the next day, and there's a bit of disconnect between the official rhetoric and what actually happened. The officials will tell you, oh, we didn't let them move back into those areas, so we wouldn't let this happen again, but we all saw they had moved back into those areas. And within 24 hours, they were rebuilding with the same materials, in the same place, with the same vulnerabilities, because they were afraid if they didn't rebuild there, then they wouldn't have that postage stamp of land. So they had to take that effort to exert and exercise their right, however that is defined. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight about this before turning it over is that the idea of insurance is a very, very northern wealthy concept. Although even in the United States, as we'll talk about with Katrina, there were insurance-related issues. That when we asked in Chile repeatedly, what about insurance? And they said, only the wealthy have insurance. That's a luxury. So when we use that phrase, I've lost everything, that had, again, in terms of their economic vulnerability, a whole other level of meaning that I don't know if we can really get our heads around and appreciate. They had lost everything. And we heard that phrasing again and again. So that bounce back, that resilience, that recovery, and then that preparedness is all unfortunately still out of whack, even after such a traumatic fire. All right, so I'm going to turn it over, I believe it's to Dr. Hagelgans.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? They can hear me, right? All right, I'm going to speak. You can hear me. All right, vulnerable populations, right? How many people in the room are part of a vulnerable population? I would think most of you would have your hands up, right? Away from home, living on your own maybe the first time. All right, so in the U.S., we have a lot of vulnerable populations, and we study vulnerable populations. In our master's program, we spend an entire semester studying vulnerable populations, which the first 3 weeks we spend basically trying to define vulnerable populations. And as you heard already here this morning, I'm not sure there's a clear-cut definition of what vulnerable populations are. I do a lot of work for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and I meet people from all over the country and all over the world, and everybody has the same issues. What's a vulnerable population? And more importantly, how do we take care of those vulnerable populations? So imagine you moved to Millersville, you came here to go to school, and we gave you some 2x4s and some wood, and we sent you down along the river to the woods and said, build yourself a nice place. We're not going to give you any heat. We're not going to give you water. And we'll give you an outhouse, because there was a lot of outhouses down there. Every house had a, what we call a porta-john, right, attached to it. And that's how they lived. And that's why they were vulnerable. Now imagine that you have little, as has been discussed already here this morning, and you're not just building your wood frame house, but you're building your wood frame house on a hill that was literally higher than 45 degrees, to the point of being scared when we were driving in vehicles when we were there. Very scared. Not a lot of things scare me. I was scared driving these hills. Some of it was the drivers. Needless to say, in addition to that, we're down there. We were a vulnerable population. I didn't speak the language. I found that out the hard way a few times when I tried to communicate, and I turned around and my interpreter was gone. Makes for an interesting smile as we're smiling back and forth, because they were speaking Spanish and I was speaking English, and we were not communicating. Communications is the key with vulnerable populations. I know there's a lot of social work students in the room, and that's what you do. Hopefully that's what you do very well, communicate with vulnerable populations. That's one of the things we struggle with in this country, all right? It's something that was beyond belief in what we saw in Chile when we were there. One of the things that, in addition to all the extreme conditions and the extreme situation that they were living in, was the amount of children and the children that were there. And one of the things we always try to teach is early childhood education. I'm sure, again, depending on what your major is here at the university, a lot of us deal with children every day. And I apologize. I talk with my hands, so if these two get kind of caught in the crossfire, I apologize for that. But everybody start moving. But so we, we're all creatures of habit, right? You probably walk to class the same way every day, and you probably, you go home and you go in the same door, and that's how people die in disasters. And the vulnerable populations have even less choices than we have. These folks didn't have any choices. If they wanted to come to the city and they wanted to have an opportunity, they had to build on the hill. The pictures that you saw here really don't even begin to show what we saw. I mean, if you can imagine a wood house built of 2x3s with 1x4 roof rafters on a hill like this, and now imagine 200 of them piled up on top of each other. There were places where you were up on the roads, and the roads were maybe 12 feet wide, where people would walk down through the hills 100, 150 feet or more to get to their houses. Now you have an issue that will be discussed by Dr. Yalda a little bit later with the changing climate, and one of the things they kept emphasizing to us was we don't get rain anymore, or we get very little rain. Everything's dried out. Everything's dried out. Everything's wood frame. They use 20-pound propane cylinders for cooking. You guys know what they are. You have them on your grills, right? You saw the fire that swept down the hill. Normally we see fires sweep up the hill. It was so dry, the fire was burning down the hill, and those 20-pound propane cylinders were blowing up. How only this few amount of people died is a miracle. All these vulnerable populations, and they didn't, they have no education. So going back to the childhood message here that we're trying to get across and what we were trying to do down there, they had a very strong fire department. It was all volunteer, 400 members. 200,000 people in the city and however many more in the hills, and a 400-person volunteer fire service. Very proud, very traditional. But we didn't see a lot of emergency management. And the one thing that was missing the most as we interviewed and talked to a lot of people in the community was no early childhood education. Most of you in this room, if your clothes caught on fire right now, one, that would be bad, but two, you would know what to do, right? What would you do? Where did you learn that? 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, right? They don't have that same luxury. They don't have this early childhood preparedness. They're not learning these habits that we're learning. Okay? So when you look at the devastation of this fire, one of the first things I expected when I got there was to be taken up on the hills, what they told us they were going to do Tuesday morning, take us up to the top of the mountain, which was a very scary trip, I might add, if I didn't say that before. And I expected to see this bottom photo right here. Everything burned out, remains, some brush, a bunch of charred. Think back to any time you've ever seen a fire in the United States, how long that property's been boarded up until somebody comes in and they rebuild it. 6 months after this fire, at least 75% of this hill was rebuilt. And the other 25% was being built as we were there. They were probably finishing houses at 100 a day, if not more. There were people all over these mountains building these houses. So we talked about resilience. That's resilience. The ability to bounce back quickly. But the downside of the story is they were vulnerable before the fire, and they're just as vulnerable now. Nothing's changed. There's nobody coming in and saying, wow, we just burned out this whole area, and these people died, and 3,000 houses were left, because 6 months after the fire, they're in the exact same condition. The one thing that I saw that was very encouraging, and I'm not going to talk about it too much because I know my colleagues will talk about it next, is all the community support. And one of the things we talk about a lot when we talk about vulnerable populations is, where do you get your support at? And they had their community centers, they had their health care clinics, and again, they'll talk about it a lot. And as especially those of you in social work will know, you need to figure out where are those places where these vulnerable populations go that you can reach out to them and we can teach them these good habits. So today when you walk home, take a different route. When you go to class today and you walk out, take a different exit. That may save your life. Thank you.
It's on. All right, so my colleague and I were going to talk to you a little bit about the social work perspective. And so when we think about the role of social workers or even human service providers in disaster mental health, we often think about the helping individuals to bounce back from a disaster, bounce back from a situation in order to enhance their emotional well-being, and because of the trauma that they experience. But I want to take a moment and highlight what Dr. Bookmiller mentioned, in that the fires hit a population that was already experiencing a trauma, and that trauma was poverty. And we need to recognize poverty as a type of trauma, because when we think about the way in which trauma is manifested, poverty produces the same outcomes as someone who experienced a natural disaster type trauma. And so you're going to have behavioral, cognitive, social behaviors and actions and various moods that are present from within someone who's experienced poverty, the same way that you're going to have those present within someone who experiences a natural disaster. And so when you have someone who's already in poverty then experience another trauma, you're going to be dealing with a complex trauma, which then results in the necessary for prolonged treatment. And we need to recognize that this is not going to resolve itself within the first month following the traumatic event. This was present within the population we visited in Chile. We, as was already stated, we recognized some of the lack of resources that they had as a result of their physical location, which prevented access to good sanitation, safe, stable housing. If we think about our responses to someone who's experienced trauma, the first thing you want to do is help establish a sense of safety and security. Well, as my colleague to the left of me stated, they did rebuild, but they rebuilt houses that are also unsafe. So again, it's this perpetuation of factors that sets themselves up for another perfect storm. I'm going to borrow my colleague's phrase. So as psychosocial teams, which is what they refer to themselves in Chile, as a community, there's a strong sense of community within Chile, and that was prevalent everywhere we went. And often with individuals who are in poverty, they tend to rely upon themselves to get their needs met because they realize that they cannot rely upon others, whether others include the government or social service agencies. And so what we found is there were community centers already in place throughout this area, and that is where individuals would go to seek assistance, whether it was assistance for food or assistance with recreational activities, healthcare services, educational services. They set up this community, as Dr. Bookmiller stated, by just claiming land and then developing, and that became their own community. They did not need outsiders, particularly government, giving them permission to do what they were doing. So when a fire strikes, what do you think the response is going to be? I heard somebody. Exactly. They're going to do it themselves. And so what we heard is that they were even trying to prevent the fire trucks from coming into the area to put out the fire. And when the community responded, which as most of you probably would, if you hear something that's devastating, you're going to, what do we often do here in the U.S.? We put together groups, right? Church groups, university groups, just social service groups, and everybody begins to help. And they start making donations and giving food and giving clothing or giving money or giving of their time to help. Well, they didn't want the help. And those who wanted to help were shocked, and we heard this numerous times. How do you get them to accept the help? We're trying to help them. We're trying to get them to overcome the emotional trauma that they've experienced, but they won't talk to us about it. They refuse to answer our questions. They refuse to talk about the fire. They refuse to let us in. And we have to think about, again, that's why it's important to go back to the original trauma that they are experiencing, which is poverty, and recognize why they are reacting the way they are. And that's a natural reaction from someone who's in poverty. And as a result, we have to figure out a way to work within their system instead of imposing ourselves on them. We're the outsiders, and we have to find the leaders within their community with whom we can partner in order to establish that plan. And then that not only helps them rebuild, but it empowers them and puts them in a position, as my colleague stated, resiliency is important, and post-trauma, we want to help them grow. The best way to help someone grow post a traumatic event is to enhance their resiliency. And this is the best way one can do that, is to partner with them, provide them with leadership opportunities to make decisions for themselves rather than outsiders coming in. And so that was I think the biggest takeaway point, is there's this strong sense of community, and we need to recognize that whether it's international or domestic. When we're dealing with vulnerable populations, we need to recognize that for the most part, they learn how to take care of themselves. They learn how to meet their own needs because they have come to realize that they can't rely upon outsiders. And so when something happens, they don't want your help. If they don't want your help just for this one isolated incident, because they realize once this fire is over, and this happened in Chile, all the help goes away. Exactly. So if we want to help sustain communities and rebuild communities, we've got to partner with them rather than impose our efforts and our resources and expertise on them. And now let my colleague talk about, I think you might need to.
It's on? Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Thank you, Dr. Rice. One of the things that I just want to share quickly is that when Dr. Rice was talking about the people in the community saying, we didn't want your help, remember talking to one social worker and saying, well, how do you work with the trauma of the fire with these clients? They don't want to talk about it. And of course, my trauma background and clinical background, and oh, well, it's typical denial. They just haven't realized the impact of the trauma yet. And then we were talking about the poverty aspect, and we see this massive wildfire that engulfs their neighborhoods, kills a number of people, burns up 5,000 homes. We see this as this horrible tragedy. To them, it's just another day in their lives. It's just another blip on the radar screen, if you will. And Dr. Rice is correct. I'm stunned hearing that they didn't want the fire brigades to come up the hills. The idea was that you haven't helped us before, why are you going to help us now? So that puts a different approach to how you work with people who have suffered these multiple traumas, but not only multiple traumas, but traumas literally on a day-to-day basis. For instance, where are you going to get fresh water? That's a pretty big trauma compared to a lot of other things. And I marveled at their resiliency and I marveled at their strength, but I also looked at it from the role of those of you who know me as an instructor. I talk a lot about self-care with social workers and making sure you don't suffer from the trauma of the stories that you hear day in and day out from your clients. So one day we were in the state service center that they have down there, and there are about 6 social workers, and they all fan out into the various neighborhoods. And Dr. Hagelgans said, boy, they really look fatigued. And I thought, well, yeah, they do look fatigued. They probably do a lot of work. So one of the questions I had, I said, what's your typical caseload look like? And one of the social workers said to me, well, we service 20,000 people. So of course I did quick math and I thought that's about 4,000 people per social worker, and I will never complain about my caseload of 6 again. I was stunned, and I was also struck by the resiliency of the workers. There seems to be few of them complain, if anything. Few of them say, oh, this is terrible, I'm burnt out, I hate this job, they don't support me. They support one another in a tremendous way, and yet the whole idea of self-care and taking care of oneself is an alien concept to them. And of course, I teach vicarious traumatization and how to work through it and how to talk to your colleagues. This is just, they deal with trauma every day. This is just a part of who they are and what they do. And there's more of a high demand down there for just knowledge about doing the work than anything else. And there's very, very little time for self-pity. And I was very impressed by that. The main theme, as Dr. Rice and Dr. Hagelgans said, was resiliency. And I was amazed at the grasp of the concept of resiliency that the community members have. Fire comes, we just rebuild again, and the community pulls together. So I was very, very heartened by that. And I was also just concerned for the workers who, in the United States, we say, well, if you're not taking care of yourself, you will not provide good services to your clients because you yourself are so traumatized. And again, that's not even a concept that they even think about down there. They give, they give, they give. And I asked one of the workers, I said, what do you do to take care of yourselves? And they said, well, we drink a lot of tea. So I was just very impressed with what they do on a daily basis and how they do it on a daily basis. And I came away thinking that their complaint factor is extremely low. And what I learned from them was that maybe we need to look at what it is we do and look at what they do and try to learn from them about how to be resilient workers and how to sort of forge through and recommit ourselves to the process.
Hello, everyone. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, but this was also a common theme that we faced during the week. There were a lot of questions that came about in the context of climate and environmental change that affects the country on a regular basis and also connects to some of the issues that have been brought up in terms of access to simple things like water and how that is going to change tremendously for this part of the world. It's something that we face in this country as well in terms of access to water, but they're facing different challenges. In addition, the conditions that lead to fires are very much affected by temperatures, by drought conditions, and by winds in the country. So the issue of climate change is something that is everywhere. So all of you are probably familiar with climate change. It's been in the news again a lot in the last few months, and of course we hear about it in different contexts. There is no doubt, and I won't bore you with too many charts, I promise, there is no doubt that the temperatures are increasing around the world. So when we look at combined land and ocean temperature, we do see these tremendous increases that have been going up at a very rapid rate, much faster than we have ever seen in the history of our recorded information. So that's a critical fact that we need to keep in mind. So there are lots of organizations that support this. So one thing I want to get across here, and we talked about quite a bit in Chile, is that there is consensus among scientists that change is taking place. There may be some disagreement over what are the exact impacts and risks for every single person in every part of the world. But there is absolutely 100% consensus that something is happening. So Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of scientists from all over the world that get together, review all of the current research, and then provide a report that has different components. There's a science part, there is one for policymakers, there is one for people that set all of the rules in different societies in terms of urban planning and things like that. And this report has been coming out, as you can see, since 1990. And of course, a lot of them are talking about not only the change, but also the fact that as humans, we are contributing to this change. So if you look at those signals, you'll notice that there is no way that natural variability can explain the rapid rate of increase in land and ocean temperatures that we have witnessed, specifically in the last 35 to 40 years. The latest one that came out just last year in 2013 points to this. So what you see in red, I won't read it to you, but you can see that there is no doubt that warming is taking place. So I won't go over that too much. Just really quick, you can see at the projected temperature changes. So if you look at the panel on sort of your right-hand side, you can see what's going to happen, right? So if you look at that top sort of hemispheric view of the Earth, what do you see? You see lots of red everywhere, right? What is that pointing to? That's pointing to basically temperature changes. And if you look around the world, you can focus on the United States, you can focus on different areas, and you can see that there is a tremendous change that's going to take place all the way through year 2100. And you may think, well, I'm not sure if I'll be around or not, but then there are our children, right? There is our future. So there are tremendous changes that are projected, same for rainfall patterns. And those really affect us on many levels. So let's switch gears to what we saw in Chile. And one of the things that obviously affects them, so this is a beautiful, by the way, picture of this area, so you can get a feel. So we got a view of the hillsides and the devastation, but it is a beautiful place. It's right on the Pacific coast, and of course they are impacted by many things such as tsunamis and earthquakes, but sea level rise is an important issue. So there are lots of coastal communities around the world that are directly impacted by climate change and this potential sea level rise, which we have seen. And this is what the projections are showing. So the global sea level rise, so if you look at the left-hand side of the graph, you can see that increase in meters. And even if you don't care about the numbers, what do you see all those lines? They're all going up, right? So this potential sea level rise is something that is going to impact all of the sea level communities. We are already seeing impacts in Florida, right? The land is getting smaller and smaller. So something to consider and think about. So we've been talking about vulnerability quite a bit. One of the major things about climate change, and this is around the world, but of course I'll talk about this in a couple of minutes here, that climate change is not fair. And that sort of ties in really well with the theme of this conference, that there are lots of consequences of climate change. If you just look at those pictures, you see anything from agriculture all the way, believe it or not, tourism is impacted by climate change, right? Where you go for your vacation is impacted by climate change. And you can see there are lots of things that affect our daily life, right? Food, water, right? We hear this all the time. If you remember last year, the corn production in the United States was highly affected, and as a result, world food access was affected, right? So these are direct consequences that we're seeing right now. So there are potential impacts 50 years, 100 years from now, but there are things that are actually impacting us right now. So these are just really quick things that I'm going to relate to Chile. So sea level rise, more occurrence of heat waves, so longer heat wave periods and higher temperatures, droughts. You can see shifting of plant and animal ranges. That means that plants and animals are in places that normally maybe don't exist, and they have to shift their location in order to find a habitat that is a good place for them, right? We're seeing the movement of vector-borne diseases, right? Showing up in places that we have never seen before, right? So all of these things are really critical in looking at this. So what we saw in Chile, their main concern is temperature rise. So I gave a talk to the School of Natural Resources there, and there was a gentleman in the crowd, and he raised his hand and said, well, you're telling me that in the next 100 years we're gonna see a 2-degree temperature change. I don't think in Chile we care about that. And I said, really, are you sure? And there were lots of students, there were about 50 or 60 students, and everybody kind of turned around and gave me a look. And I said, there are two things you have to consider. A 2-degree temperature change may be nothing, but how the biological systems respond to that 2-degree temperature change is a big question mark, right? So we really don't understand that. We know a lot. Science has come a long way, but there are certain responses and what we call feedback mechanisms, how different systems impact one another, that are still very unclear. And so that's one thing. The next thing is, if it gets really warm and you have less precipitation, you have less water. If it gets warmer, your glaciers are going to melt. Where do you think Chile gets its water? The major source of water is from the glaciers, from snowpacks, right? And both of those things are decreasing. The glaciers are melting, the snowpacks are decreasing. So all of these things are connected, right? So a 2-degree temperature change can actually have a much larger impact on many components of the climate system in Chile and around the world, right? But it does change quite a bit. So I'm going to run through these really quick. So basically glaciers, snow, heat waves, and I think Dr. Bookmiller mentioned this, and we heard, I don't know, one of you mentioned this. I didn't hear this because I was talking in different places and didn't get to go on some of the tours, but they have a 30-degree or a number 30 rule. Yeah, 30, 30, 30. So temperatures of 30 degrees Celsius, winds of greater than 30 knots, and humidity of less than 30%. And that's the magic recipe for the fires. So high temperatures, low humidity, and high winds. So 30-knot winds are pretty good. All right. So Chile has done some things really quick. They have taken some steps, even though Chile is the lowest emitter of carbon dioxide in South America, right? So they don't have a large population. But at the same time, they've taken some steps. All the way back in 2008, they came up with a climate change action plan, something we don't really have in this country. You may want to make a note of that. They're trying to institute a carbon tax. So people have to pay a higher tax for more use of carbon, right? I don't know how many of you keep track of your carbon footprint, right? How did you get here? How are you going to, what are you going to do this weekend, right? Our carbon footprint is an important thing to keep in mind. Having said this, they have all these in place, but when you talk to people, they say, really, we have that? I saw a lot of questions. I got a lot of questions. Well, this hasn't been implemented, and we got a lot about. We understand the science. We know there is risk, but our politicians are not necessarily interested in implementing these, and that's a key factor that we still struggle with in this country, right? We know something is happening. We know there are impacts, but what do we do about it, right? How do you implement that? How do you set policy? How do you get people to really do something, right? That's important. So these are some critical issues. We need to get the message across. Science needs to talk in a way that people understand. One of the firefighters asked me a really good question. He said, you project all this information in probabilities. You say there's a probability that a 2-degree temperature change is going to have this kind of impact. What does that mean to an average person? It's similar to our forecast. There's a 30% chance of rain tomorrow. there's always a lot of question about, does that mean it's going to rain or not rain, or rain here 30%, not rain next door 30%? So the way that we communicate that information is extremely important to lead to effective policy making, right? So there's still a big gap between science knows everything. That was supposed to be a joke, right? Science knows quite a bit, right? We've come a long way. But how does that lead to, and these are my last two slides here. So science can inform us about climate change, and that's what we learned in Chile. Everywhere I went, I was impressed by the level of knowledge about climate change, potential impacts of climate change, and what needs to be done. But lots of gaps between whether or not at the level of political setting and in terms of policy making, people are ready to take that quantum leap to really make those significant changes that will have a long-term impact. But what science can't decide, and this really fits in well, I think, with the theme of this conference, is science can't decide what's fair for different nations and people, right? And that's really important, right? So a lot of solid information, but fairness is kind of another issue, right? So I'll leave you with this. Climate change is deeply unfair. So if you look at this map, you'll notice that the poor will suffer the most. And I think this came across, we talked about this, that it's not a matter of how wealthy nations or developed nations will deal with climate change. They are going to be more impacted because of population, because of development. But if you think about it in terms of what will happen to poor nations and developing countries, there's significant impact. So I think I'll end on that. Thank you.
So we want to make just a couple of final connections to bring it home to our own experience here in the United States, and to make it, and then to open it up to discussions. Forgive me, I'm just looking very quickly for. Oh, sorry. Did you where it went? Yeah.
Would you like me to open it?
I'm looking for a previous one.
Oh, here, I can, let's see where it is.
Oh, maybe it's this one. No, it's yours.
What did you call it?
Policy conference 2014. So we're getting back to just files. It didn't save down.
If you want that, you're
Oh, you have it. Maybe go this way and turn through that. I got it, actually.
You have it?
Yeah, I can do it. Thanks.
Just we want to go back to it. There we go. Yeah.
Sorry, folks. Super quick.
There you go.
Okay.
Okay. My name is Bob Bookmiller, and full disclosure here, while I thought these people were my friends, I was not allowed to go on the Chilean trip. But my purpose today is just to bring this back to the United States. And as my colleague and wife mentioned at the beginning of the conference, the center here at the university has been very busy in October. And we started the month with an international conference, an international symposium, looking at Hurricane Katrina and focusing on the global lessons that came out of the Katrina experience. So next August, it'll be the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, and we brought together scholars from France and Australia, New Zealand, some really impressive folks from the Gulf Coast that were involved in dealing with the impact of Hurricane Katrina. And then we had as a keynote speaker Pat Santos, who was involved with the response to Hurricane Katrina and would later go on to serve in a variety of capacities with Homeland Security and emergency preparedness with the governor's office in Louisiana. So just in terms of Katrina, you can see some of the bullet points in regards to the impact of this particular natural disaster in the United States. New Orleans has the distinction of being bordered with the Gulf Coast, with the Mississippi River, and with Lake Pontchartrain. And so with the hurricane coming in a city that is built largely below sea level, most of the population within New Orleans was impacted in some way. So most of the neighborhoods were impacted by this disaster. But what is somewhat striking, and just to give you a snapshot and try to bring this back to this conference, is that the poverty rate in New Orleans is about twice the national average. So 1/3 of the population, 1/3 of the residents in New Orleans live below the poverty line. And then if you want to factor also onto that too, that the minority population within New Orleans is about 72% of the residents living within the city, or at least the pre-Katrina population was about 72%. And that's to compare that with Louisiana, about 36% of the population of Louisiana is minority population. So when you talk about the fact that the entire population was vulnerable because of the impact of Hurricane Katrina, and then you look at the particular sectors of the population in terms of those in poverty, you look at the minority population, you look at those other vulnerable aspects of the population in terms of the elderly and the disabled, Katrina really brings home, I think, a lot of the information and the observations that my colleagues had in regards to Chile. And one of the things that struck me in terms of some of the conversations with the symposium was the whole issue of evacuation. That the plan within New Orleans was that people would use their personal vehicles to leave town. But if you look at the fact that 1 in 5 families did not have an automobile, that right there in terms of the evacuation plan, there was a problem. So when you think of some of the images from Katrina, and you think of the crowds gathering at the Superdome, and you think of some of the reporting from this experience, and I know I talk in my classes about how that you look at the headlines and you look at the way that this disaster was reported outside the United States, that there were a lot of headlines talking about a third world tragedy, and something like this should not be happening in the wealthiest country. When you look at then some of the plans that have been put into place and the lessons learned, if you will, from Katrina, and you just focus on issues such as evacuation, what Pat Santos was talking about when he was here, that in preparing then for future natural disasters and looking at hurricanes that would hit the Gulf Coast, that they were focusing a lot on how do you get the people out, how do you evacuate individuals. So if you're focused on the fact that a lot of people don't have personal automobiles, well, what can you do to think about how then to evacuate the population? And one of the aspects that was considered in Louisiana then was that you would contract out for buses. You would go to private companies, you would contract buses, and you would have that ready at evacuation centers that people then, they didn't have transportation, there was transportation there. But you had to think about this, you had to plan for this, you had to contract with these private companies to do that, and you had to do that ahead of time before you knew even what the impact of the natural disaster was going to be on Louisiana or the Gulf Coast, New Orleans or the Gulf Coast, and you had to make that decision. So you had to commit significant amounts of money, and it was $1.2 million, didn't they say? So that at one point that they waited till the call was made that they were going to probably need this. They signed the contracts, $1.2 million, and then they ended up not needing the buses and the transportation. And you look at a state like Louisiana, which is comparatively less well off than other parts of the United States, and yet you have that kind of a process in place. For a country like Chile, there's not that potential to be able to do that pre-planning. I don't know if you wanted to.
Well, I just wanted to say, having been intimately involved with both the Katrina conference in Chile,
And with me.
yes, and I thought, and married to him, that when I actually went to Chile, I had Katrina in my mind constantly, because we had sat for 2 days looking at how Louisiana had kind of tried to get ahead and to improve. And it was interesting because I actually used some of these examples in Chile, and the first response that I would get is, well, you can do that in the United States. We couldn't possibly do it here. And what I thought was kind of interesting about that was that, no, you don't have the ability to contract yearly for buses you might never use at $1.2 million, which, by the way, is very relevant when you talk about, for instance, tsunamis and trying to get people to the high hills, and you have disabled and elderly and so forth, no cars. How are you going to evacuate? But I thought in some ways it was also a little bit of a trap. And I mean this actually to leave you with a more kind of hopeful twist on this, not just because that's my inherent nature, but I truly believe that there were extraordinary opportunities in Chile to do things differently that didn't necessarily involve money. And we all do that, don't we? Well, I would do that if I had more money, or we could make this much better if we had more money. And what I encouraged the Chileans to do in my contacts was to think what one could do in the area of risk reduction, mitigation, preparedness, recovery that didn't require money. And one of the things was, all right, you didn't necessarily right off the bat have that expensive bus contract, but the very first thing you could do was do vulnerability mapping. And you could say, block by block, where are the disabled? Where are the elderly? Where are those, for different reasons, would not be able to move quickly? You start there. You know that. And that can be a voluntary activity with students from the universities who can apply their expertise as a practical training and research opportunity. And then you see what links and what networks you have. Make sure that 51, Avenida Molina, that Carlos calls his cousin who has a taxi and is going to get there. You can do it in a very micro way. You just have to be creative about it. But they hadn't even really reached the level of assessing what it was that they needed to do. And so it was kind of encouraging when I was there that, yes, it brought to my attention that even though we consider Louisiana one of the poorest parts of the country, it was a whole lot wealthier. It was dream fantasy level for some of these neighborhoods in Chile. But also I was worried for the Chileans that they not get into a corner. One of the things we asked, Dr. Felizzi mentioned about self-care, and Dr. Hagelgans, the fire service responders had clearly been very traumatized by this fire. And we said, what do you do in terms of self-care and working through that trauma for yourselves? And they said, oh, we don't have the money for that. And Dr. Hagelgans responded, we have volunteers that do that. We have psychologists who offer to be on call to do that. So I think I want to stress that none of this is a corner that we can't get out of. Yes, we have very, very big challenges with regard to climate change. But there's room for people who think creatively and who tap into the energy. Chile has an incredible volunteer sector. They're extremely proud of it. They're very proud of their country. One of the things we noticed is that there were Chilean flags, even outside of the very poorest houses. And one of my colleagues said, September 11th. There was this incredible sense of patriotism and kind of collective passion. So those things are resources. They are not economic resources, but they're capital and human capital resources of another kind that we can still kind of think in terms of synergies and creativity to bring those out so that even when disasters happen, we can reduce what they do to us and we can also hasten our recovery. So we're going to stop there, and I know we've thrown a lot at you. I hope you get from us, both of these were passion projects for us. And I know all of my colleagues with regard to Chile, well, New Orleans is also a gorgeous city as well. We visited for January. Chile is a wonderful, wonderful country. I mentioned to them, this was my 6th time, and I said, it will get under your skin before you leave. And my colleagues felt that way. I would encourage you to go and visit and invest in the tourism industry and invest in its economic livelihood. And the people are phenomenal. I don't in any way want you to leave and put in your extra credit summaries, oh, those poor people of Chile. I don't know how they get up in the morning, because nothing further could be from the truth. They are rebuilding. They are investing in their future. They are hopeful. And they welcomed us because they were looking for some out-of-the-box solutions to make things better. So they were very much focused on the future, and I hope that we would all encourage them in that area. Any questions, comments, observations? We have a little bit of time. Hey, good going, guys. We did better than we did down there.
I think a couple of the speakers mentioned communications on one level or another, but could you elaborate a little bit more on how you see that needing to improve, what steps need to be taken?
Did I say it? Dang it. That's your thing. I shouldn't have said it. Are we on? All right. One of the things that we noticed, and I'll go back to 2006, just a few miles from here in the nickel mines. When we had the nickel mine shooting, one of the things that happened is people all over the world knew that we had the nickel mine shooting. And we were there dealing with that tragedy, and one of the things we missed completely was that the local community was not being communicated with because they didn't watch TV because they were Amish. And so one of the things that I think I learned, I traveled around with these guys when we went to the clinics and the centers, is that, you have to figure out where it is that you can get the message to the people. And I think that the community centers, there were people in these community centers that were there volunteering because their houses burned down. And they said, we can either sit here and be sad, or we can go back and rebuild our community center. So one of the keys when you're dealing with vulnerable populations is, we don't all get our messages the same way. Most of you probably don't get your news in a newspaper, if you know what a newspaper is. And so we have to figure out what those means of communicating with the various groups are. And most importantly, we have to have multiple ways to communicate. So, whether it's through the Spanish American Civic Association here in the city, or whether it's through the bishops in the Amish church. So, and in Chile, the thing that we learned was it was the community centers and then I guess they're called healthcare centers.
And one other thing, if I can connect it to trauma, 'cause I know that that's part of the theme. The importance of communication to minimize the trauma is key, because one of the aspects of trauma-informed practice is to help regenerate the left side of the brain, which gets shut down during a traumatic event. And the way in which we do that is to make sure that they have accurate information, because we need to dispel some of those myths, because if we don't help dispel it, then their thoughts, their images, their beliefs about this event will overtake kind of their actions and their behaviors. And so it's important that the communication that they receive is accurate. So anyone who's playing that role post-event, a traumatic event, it's important for them that you have that dialogue to assess their understanding of the event and then help deliver accurate information.
You mentioned that you suggested to the Chileans to cheaply, using university students, to map out where the vulnerable populations are in their areas, in the country, to be prepared for the next possible disaster. And I was wondering if we could bring that back to this area, not just the United States, even more locally to this area, and if that's ever been done. Because I know that I just moved recently, but the address that I used to have was a Millersville address, but we weren't in Millersville Borough, we were in Manor Township. And whenever you wanted to get anything done, there was a lot of finger pointing, it seemed. Oh, that's not Millersville Borough, that's Manor Township. No, that's not Manor Township, that's Millersville Borough. So it seems that we need better communication here, and I wonder if either one of those areas, or if Lancaster County, to look even larger, has ever done any assessment of vulnerable populations and how to handle, God forbid TMI ever has a problem again. I was not here when that happened, but I know there's now, well, there was in phone books, back before phone books got super skinny and lost a lot of valuable pages, what route you're supposed to take. But from what I understand, that was never really feasible if you really looked at how the size of the populations are to get onto very few routes to get out of here. But again, as somebody said, not everybody in New Orleans had cars. So what do we do about all the people who, I know Lee Avenue, is it Lee Avenue has a section of elderly people. I don't think they use cars. I know two people who live there. They don't have cars, so they could not get out easily. But what kind of assessment has been done, if one has, and how do we get that going for here?
I just want to say something, and I know probably you guys have a lot to say on this. I was very inspired by the talk yesterday that opened, unfortunately there weren't a huge amount of people here, but about universities as anchor institutions, that universities and medical institutions can really, because we don't pick up and move like corporations, and you know, we are anchors in the truest sense. And I think that Millersville, as our partner university there, yeah, I don't want to make it's just about Valpo, that, you know, we take this very, very seriously too, is that we have extraordinary amounts of resources that can be used and leveraged with regard to the community. So I do know that work. Somewhat happens that I do want to turn it over to my colleagues.
So there's something known as an emergency operation plan, and every municipality has one. The university has one. In fact, our students have worked on it. And I would be lying if I said it was perfect. I would be lying if I said we knew where all the vulnerable populations were, how to deal with them. But our plan that gets redone every 2 years addresses vulnerable populations. So for instance, Norrisville Borough and Manor Township now have one plan. They have one emergency management group that works together. And so our plan, which was just redone actually by one of our students, does address some of the vulnerable populations and some of the issues that you spoke about. The county also has an emergency operation plan, and they also address a lot of the vulnerable populations. And to go back to the theme and tying it in with the university, many of our students that we have in our program have worked with the county and locally here to help with those plans on the vulnerable populations. And the class I was speaking about earlier, we have students all over the world because we're an online program. And one of their assignments is to identify all the vulnerable populations in their local community. And then when the semester is over, they take this research and they give it to their local community to help that local community identify the vulnerable populations. We're not perfect and we're not there, but we're certainly a lot further along than we were previously.
Other questions? The mic, who wants it?
Somebody over there, Paul. I want to see him run over there.
I just wanted to add that if you're interested in these issues and these themes, Dr. Hagelgans did mention that we have a nationally recognized master's in emergency management under the auspices of the center. It is 100% online. It can be done from anywhere in the world, or it could be done 5 feet away from here in Millersville. We have both contingents, but it is an international cohort, and also has military folks stationed abroad that join us. And we also have the only double master's degree in the country that's the joint MS in emergency management with a master's in social work. And we are considered to be very cutting edge in having developed that program. So for all of you in the audience who's like, I was really interested in this talk, I might want to do more in this, or this ties in, it is multidisciplinary. Look how many different disciplines you have sitting up here. You can find your trajectory into this study very, very easily. As we said, it's across communities. And so we hope that you might join us in that capacity as well.
And if I just may add, if you are not interested in pursuing maybe a full-blown degree, we also have lots of training opportunities at the center. For example, one is the Community Emergency Response Team, which you will get certified. This is a FEMA program. It's only 8 sessions, and you can come and learn about basic emergency response training. So if you go to our website, if you just do CDRE on the Millersville site, lots of things will come up. Be happy to help you with, and we have lots of other things. We have training in business continuity. It's only a 16-hour course. So lots of opportunities to kind of get your feet wet if you don't necessarily want to pursue the degree programs. And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.